Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to CoachX Live with the Institute of Coaching. My name is Jeffrey Hull. I'm the Executive Director at the Institute of Coaching, and I am here with one of our top thought leaders, Dr. Lisa Orbe-Austin, who has been, I can honestly say, our very first second timer
Oh, I
on
didn't know
LinkedIn
that.
Live. Yeah, you're the first person that we've had 2 times. And so I'm really excited to have you with us again, Lisa. And part of the reason we're doing this is because you're going to be doing a webinar with us next week, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And you also have a wonderful new book out that we want to talk about. So I just want to welcome everyone and get the comments started. So I'm going to look up in the corner and see if people can say hello. Hopefully they'll be coming in. We love to hear from where people are, and it's usually good afternoon, good evening, good morning, because there's folks from all over. But for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Lisa Orbe-Austin and her amazing work on Imposter Syndrome, let me just give a quick background for you. As I said, she's been with us before. She was one of our top-rated keynote speakers at our conference a year ago. And it's just a pleasure to have her back with us. So Lisa Orbe-Austin is a licensed psychologist. She's also an executive coach, as I said, with expertise in imposter syndrome, career advancement, and leadership development. She's the co-founder and partner of an organization called Dynamic Transitions Psychological Consulting, a career and executive coaching consultancy based in New York. She regularly consults with organizations in the private sector, with nonprofits, with educational institutions, and she focuses on supporting their employees and senior leadership teams to address gender bias, diversity, equity and inclusion, leadership development, effective communication, team cohesion, and managing conflict management, among other things. And we know her as really one of the world-leading thought leaders and researchers in this area of imposter syndrome. We had her speak at a webinar and at our conference a little over a year ago, I think, on her first book called Own Your Greatness, Overcome Imposter Syndrome, Beat Self-Doubt, and Succeed in Life. And amazingly enough, she has a new book out. She's one of the quickest that I've seen, but it's actually super impressive and very interesting. We're going to talk about it today, called Your Unstoppable Greatness. Break free from imposter syndrome, cultivate your agency, and achieve your ultimate career goals, that just was released a few months ago. So with that, I want to say welcome. It's nice to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff. I'm excited to be back.
We're starting to get hellos, so just quickly say hello if you're joining us. Oh my God, Istanbul and South Africa came up immediately. So already a global audience. And hello from Arizona, Orlando. It's great. So Lisa, part of the reason I wanted to have you join us again so soon is because your new book takes us into a whole new level of the impact of imposter syndrome within organizational settings and toxic organizational settings and how to address that. But I think before we jump into that, it would be good for you to give us just a quick overview of how you wound up becoming so focused on this research, and maybe a quick summary. I know it's hard to do, but a quick summary of some of the key themes of your first book.
Yeah, sure. So imposter syndrome became an interest of mine because I had dealt with it myself, and it had been a very powerful factor in my own career. It had been a very difficult thing for me to break free of. And I found myself oftentimes in roles that I didn't really want to be in, but couldn't admit to myself that I didn't want to be there. I was just happy to be there and just felt like I was never good enough to be anywhere. And so it really sort of trailed me. And it wasn't until I actually started to face it myself that I became interested and started writing about it. And from writing about it, that's where my acquisition editor found me and has asked us to write a book on imposter syndrome. And so the first book is really about how to deal with the intrapersonal issues related to imposter syndrome. So how to overcome it within, how to deal with the factors within. And so it's a 3-part model, the 3 C's model that we talk about, that is the 9 steps that help people, that are the most effective interventions in overcoming imposter syndrome. And since the book has come out, we've clearly, been kind of looking at people's outcomes, and have seen if people complete the 9 steps, they see, and actually do the work, we see about a 30% decrease in their imposter syndrome scores after completing the work.
Great.
We see a sustained result 6 months and a year following. So it's not a short-term kind of change. We see a sustaining, kind of consistent over time ability to kind of keep it decreased. And so it's been really wonderful and fun to see people actually be able to change this experience pretty quickly with the tools in the book. It's very concrete. Like, we're talking about dealing with automatic negative thoughts, and we're talking about kind of how do you build a community around you that doesn't reinforce imposter syndrome. We're talking about things like how do you kind of understand where imposter syndrome came from, and then how it shows up today and why it shows up today. So that's really the first book, and it's really very much outcome driven. Like, we want to see a change in your experience. We don't just want to talk about it just to talk about it.
Yeah, I think it's one thing to reflect on your own experience and maybe sort of self-diagnosis, or recognize someone on your team that might, be suffering from that. And certainly coaches loved the work that you did, and the webinar. And I encourage, because there's a recording of that webinar on our website. So anyone who has not seen her, Lisa described the 3 A's from her first book, please take a look at that webinar, because it's really powerful. And I've just heard from a lot of coaches that it became a wonderful tool for them to work with clients once they suspected that there might be this kind of dynamic going on in their interpersonal dynamic. So, and I also, just before I forget, want to encourage, now that we have folks saying hello from all over, wow, Singapore, hi, Wendy. If you have a question for Lisa, please put it in the chat box. We'll try to get to a few of them, and we'll also make sure that we save the chat. So if you have a question, we'll be able to follow up with you. But I want to switch gears, because this new book is really taking more of an ecosystem view, right? Of how it's one thing to focus on the individual, which is core. You have to start with the narrative, the history, and what is really at play within an individual's interpersonal psyche, in terms of having them do the personal work they need to do to overcome or move through this dynamic. But as you start to really dig in this new book, you talk a lot about the organizational system, and how it may unfortunately be reinforcing the very thing that the coach and the individual is trying to work through. So start by sharing with us a little bit about how you came to want to broaden that focus, and the research that you did that led to the second book.
Yeah, so after the first book, we were actually, conducting courses and different boot camps and masterclasses on the topic. And we were watching people actually really do amazing things that were kind of even blowing my mind in terms of what they could do in terms of getting more money or getting a new job, just because they were able to really face it. I mean, I was seeing things like, I saw someone double their salary in a matter of weeks. It was crazy. And I still see it, and it was phenomenal. But one of the things that I was sort of perplexed by, and both Richard and I were very confused by, was we're seeing them really believe in who they are, what they're worth, their value, doing amazing things. But I still see elements of it that, still in the way that they're functioning at work, that are troubling. And I think there was a particular person that we were working with who had really been able to kind of really vocalize what she wanted, really be able to change a lot of the things that were going on, but still in the dynamic at work, she was operating with this imposter syndrome paradigm. She didn't believe she was an imposter anymore. She didn't believe she was a fraud, but still overworking, overfunctioning, being perfectionistic, taking stuff, I was going to say crap at work, that really she didn't need to, that was still sort of evidencing itself. And we were like, there's a systemic piece to this that we need to kind of talk about, how, when you still feel like you are worthy, you do belong, you do have a right to be there, and that you can speak up for yourself. There's still this piece where you're behaving sometimes, showing up in the same ways, because the dynamics are so familiar and so strong. They're pulling you into this behavior of overworking, overfunctioning, doing other things. And so the second book became a desire to kind of address those kind of organizational systemic dynamics and the agency in which you can actually influence those dynamics or feel a sense of power within those dynamics from the work that people have done in that first experience with Own Your Greatness. And so we wanted to take them, because oftentimes they would tell us like things like, I can't do anything about it. Like, this is just the way it is. And I'm like, is it really? Like, what can we do with what you know about who you are and what you're capable of to kind of change some of this or get out? Because they were often feeling very stuck in these circumstances, even though they felt like they belonged now, they still felt stuck. And so that's
I think one of the paradoxes of the work that you do with a coach or by yourself with your tools is you actually reinforce a sense of self-efficacy and a sense of effectiveness and a sense of competence. And if you think of self-determination theory, you know, people actually start to feel more competent, they feel more motivated, and they want to be related to an environment that actually reinforces those positive things, right? And then they all of a sudden recognize, or they may already have known all along, that the environment that they're in is actually pulling them backwards towards the very thing that they've been working on.
Yeah.
And so what I love about your talk about like an eco or systemic agency is that it starts to empower individuals to really take on the leadership necessary to change the environment. So talk about the model that you share in the book, because it's really powerful.
Yeah, so the model, and you had mentioned of sort of what research had also led you to the book, led you to the second book. One of the findings in the research has been that imposter syndrome is correlated to greater organizational loyalty. So people will stay places that are not good for them longer when they have imposter syndrome. And so this model, then we call it the 3 A's model. The first A is agency, sort of really helping people to really connect to what they want for themselves, because imposter syndrome often leads them feeling like, you know, I want what everyone else wants for me. Does everyone else approve of this? Like they get lost in sort of the idea of like, what is it that they want themselves? And so we really want to connect them back to what do you want? Because we saw in a lot of the work was that people were like, I'm an engineer, but I actually hate being an engineer. They were having these sort of revelations, like internally, like I've done this because other people thought this is what I should do, but I actually don't really love it. And so really helping them to kind of free them to kind of figure that out, and then learning how to also use that agency to determine how they wanted to move forward. And then dealing, so that agency chapter ends with sort of dealing with like burnout and perfectionism, and really helping them to kind of do some of the pieces that we didn't cover in book 1 around like how almost like there's like a systemic set of thinking that goes along with perfectionism that keeps it embedded, that you believe that you are successful because you are perfectionistic, and that if you let it go, you're going to fall apart. Like, how do you break some of that thinking?
Okay. Right.
And then the second piece is around assessment, sort of really assessing, we start with, as psychologists, we start with the first system that you ever had, which is your family system.
Right.
And there are very common correlates to imposter syndrome to types of family systems. So a codependent family system is very common. Also, having a narcissistic parental figure or more than one narcissistic parental figure is really common. And so we have them examine the early family systems. What are some of the familiar pieces related to imposter syndrome that might be there that also might be showing up in your work life today? Because they are familiar, because you're used to them, because this is what you're used to kind of succeeding up against. And so teaching them kind of like, what are the things that you might need to be observant about in your system that might be replicating early family systems that embed the imposter syndrome. So we're looking at sort of codependent work dynamics.
I love that because one of the things that I've seen with my clients over and over again, not just coincidentally, is a recognition, once they reflect in the way you're talking about, that they have chosen to work in an environment that actually has many components that replicate their family system.
Yes.
And it's probably because it's a comfort zone, right? And initially they're pulled in to a system. They're not aware that it's actually going to replicate that very toxicity.
Yes. And like, things that, and I think for us, it's really a kind of like, yeah, that makes sense. For a lot of people, it's shocking how similar these kinds of family dynamics and their work dynamics are, and how sometimes unconscious the pull is to lean into an organization that says things like, we're just like a family. Well, just like a family is code for we engage in codependent behavior, and we have no boundaries and rules, and And so helping them to understand sort of what that looks like. It might have been very appealing to think about working as a family, but then
Right.
when you run into the problems of working as a family, then it's no longer appealing, or it's hard. Even if it is familiar. And so teaching them those dynamics in that assessment and learning how to assess an organization and the kinds of things that are unhealthy for you because they're familiar to the dysfunctional dynamics that you grew up with
Yep.
that led to this. And the
Right.
last piece is actualization. It's really that piece you were talking about around like, imposter syndrome leads to dysfunctional behaviors in leadership. It makes you do things like micromanage others and, model overwork and engage in perfectionistic behaviors. So how do we kind of show up in our own spaces, whether we are formally a leader or informally a leader? How do we show up in spaces where we are not accidentally reinforcing other people's imposter syndrome or behaving in ways that the imposter syndrome has told us is effective, that actually is quite dysfunctional? So really taking ownership of that kind of leadership perspective, and how do you add to a culture? How do you add in a healthy way to an organization that is anti-imposter syndrome? And so that last piece is that.
Yeah, and I'm just curious to hear from you maybe some examples of where, you've worked with folks that have recognized their own challenges around imposter syndrome. They see it, they've done some of the work that was in your first book, and then they recognize from the second book or from their own desire, they want to feel empowered, not to quit their job, but to have an influence on the system in which they operate. And I'm curious, what kinds of things do you find work well? Let's say if they're not in a formal leadership position, or they're in a mid-level. Obviously, that's even more common, where they're not at the top of the organization, but they may have some leadership. What kinds of things do you recommend they do?
Yeah, so things that we talk about in the book are around sort of like never to do it alone. So if you want to make change, you must do it collectively. Like you have to find like-minded folk in a variety of positions within the organization, some with like legitimate authority that you can
Right.
actually utilize. But doing it as a collective, it's much harder to target someone trying to make change who's doing it from a collective stance than it is as if you're doing it from one. We also talk about sort of like what psychological safety is and how important and critical it is to creating kinds of new environments. And that even if you have a purview that is small, like you have a team of 3, how do you create psychological safety within that team of 3 so that if they don't feel safe anywhere else, they feel safe within the team? And that in essence, you're modeling that for larger and other parts of the organization. We talk about also really kind of showing and engaging in like healthy feedback, because one of the things that people with imposter syndrome are very conflict averse. So they don't want to get into critical feedback or constructive feedback. They just want to blow it off or push it under the rug. And learning how that constructive feedback can be helpful to people's development, and really being able to understand that it's actually okay to give feedback, receive it, learning how to kind of engage in this in a healthy way that we've typically been avoiding. Learning how to also engage behaviors that are critical to kind of like seeing people in growth mindset perspectives, like looking at the zone of proximal development and really helping people actually stretch themselves and not believe, oh, this is who they are. This is what, because we can tend to be super black and white
Right.
about the way that we see people and their functioning because of the perfectionism and other aspects. So really kind of changing the way we frame what's happening in our worlds, the way we what's happening in our teams, and the influence that we can have to kind of make things better, even in smaller pieces, in sort of like smaller areas, and hopefully kind of seeing kind of other change in other places. If you don't, I think I'm a big fan of like, use your agency to go. Like,
Right.
like I don't think you should try to change it if it's resistant to change,
But if you
And
have an opportunity and you are in a position where you have some level of influence and authority, then these are the kinds of tools and frames that you can work with in terms of how you can actually potentially change the system. And at the end of the day, what we want as coaches is to help our clients create organizations that help people flourish, right?
yes,
Help people get really not just high performance, but also human well-being. So
yes.
I want to encourage you. We have a few minutes. If you have a question that you'd like to ask Lisa, now's the time to do it. So throw it in the chat box. But let's talk about executives and your perspective on those that do have influence and maybe are listening, executive coaches that are on this call, or leaders that you've worked with who are really interested in making a more supportive environment that actually moves us away from imposter syndrome. What kinds of things can the senior folks be thinking about doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an exciting place to kind of intervene on, because I think there is more access, influence, ability to change things really directly and quickly.
Right.
And I do think, really it's really kind of, I often say, like, doing an assessment and doing an audit of the kinds of behaviors that are going on your team first, that potentially need to be changed and altered, that may be reinforcing imposter syndrome, maybe reinforcing things that we talk about, like having scapegoats and stars, and really be accountable for the ways in which that may have shown up and how to change that. How can we actually, having conversations with leaders, even just today, about sort of like certain people who feel a certain sense of position in their group that don't want that shared amongst other people in the group. Well, that's a problem, because other people who are not getting access to you, or feeling like, they're a star, don't feel like they have the same kinds of connection with you, influence. So really watching for certain behaviors that we outline in the chapters that, you might want to change within. And then also then kind of communicating that to others about the work that you're doing. And so that other leaders in their areas can also do those kinds of things in their structures. And so I do think, you have such an opportunity to really change dynamics, but you have to take accountability for the way that you may have accidentally reinforced them. And I think that's the hard part, is really taking ownership for, like, oops, I did that. And so how do I undo some of that, and kind of create a safer, healthier place for everyone to be, where everyone feels like they're in their own process of development.
Yeah, I think what you're pointing to is having the leaders become not only self-aware, but socially aware,
Yeah.
right? Of the
Yep.
way that they operate themselves, the way they see themselves projects out into the organization. If they can become more accountable for that, then they can actually influence in ways that are positive.
Yes. And I think it models a great kind of intrapersonal kind of insight, when you can say, or you can show, like, I've done this, and we're going to do this. And I can take on accountability for that and kind of try to move the dynamic. And so I do think it is a very powerful message, to your direct reports, even if you don't explicitly say what you're doing,
Right. So Paula is asking a question, which I think is sort of fundamental, which I'd just to have you share quickly, which is, if you have a client and you sense that they have imposter syndrome, how do you help them become aware?
I mean, I think sort of helping them to explain the concept to them, like telling them sort of, have you ever heard of this concept, imposter syndrome? And you have to explain it fairly immediately, because sometimes people feel like they're being accused of being an imposter.
Right.
And sort of say it's this experience when you're competent and expert and have experience, and yet you feel like you haven't internalized any of that, so you feel like you may be a fraud. Do you experience that? Do you experience feelings? And sort of really understanding the concept in a very kind of nuanced way. Like, in the first book, we have all kinds of different details that you can sort of share with a client. And if they can identify with a fair amount of them, they often are like, oh, this is what I've been experiencing. It can be very helpful for them, because they often feel like something's wrong with them,
Right.
and that they're the only one experiencing this. So I think it's really helpful for them to see that they're not, and it's a very common experience. And so it can change the game. So I think really talking about it with clients, many of the people that I have worked with have said a manager said this to them, and it changed their life. And so it's been really helpful for people to educate others on the topic.
Yeah, I think the crucial thing is, as a coach, creating an environment where there's enough safety,
Yeah.
so that people are comfortable reflecting on how some of this behavior, perfectionism, overwork, some of the things that you outline in your first book, actually, they don't even recognize it as imposter syndrome, because they thought it was just normal for them to do that.
Yeah.
They're overachievers that never feel good about themselves, kind of thing.
Yep. Yes.
So we have a couple questions coming in about, there have been some other things written, like in HBR and other places, about gender bias and racism. And, it would be remiss for me to not get your input around some of this, because I think this is something that crosses genders and crosses races, but you're really an expert on where do you find the distinctions and what should we be thinking about?
Yeah. So that article drove me bananas, and is really, to me, and I've said it pretty. I've actually been on an NPR radio show with the authors of that article. I said pretty blatantly that it is not substantiated by the research. Because what the research shows is that both men and women experience imposter syndrome, and they're starting to look at different gender expressions currently, and that this is not a woman experience. I think it's been popularized in the media as a woman experience, but that's not necessarily the truth. And so there's over 40 years of research on the topic. It's not also just popped up recently. It's not just about self-doubt. There's many things in that article that are problematic that really kind of, I think, really just captured a zeitgeist moment, and people just went with it. It became a clickbait kind of like viral thing. But I think also what I have said too is that systems do reinforce and benefit from, oppressive systems do reinforce and benefit from imposter syndrome. You're overworking, you're overfunctioning, you're doing more than one person's job. So they're benefiting from, and so as a result, they do perpetuate it. And that's what this whole second book is about. But what the research has shown is that, you know, people who are Black or people of color don't experience imposter syndrome in greater numbers than anybody else. Oppression doesn't cause imposter syndrome. It does benefit from it and it does reinforce it, but we see it in privileged groups all the time. In addition, I think it's really important, that article also, what made me super angry about is it got people thinking that imposter syndrome is not a thing, it's not real.
Right.
And that what we do know is that when marginalized groups do have additional negative outcomes as a result of imposter syndrome. So for example, the research has shown that for Black people, when they have imposter syndrome, they experience greater levels of depression when they experience a moment of discrimination. So if you don't deal with it, your depression is higher. They also show that imposter syndrome is a greater contributor to psychological distress than minority status. So there's been a lot of research, and the top researcher currently in imposter syndrome is Black. It's a Black man named Kevin Coakley at the University of Michigan. He's been commissioned to write a book for the American Psychological Association on the topic. Like, so this is not, oftentimes you hear it's a white woman. This is not any of that. This has become popularized.
It's stereotyping.
Yeah. And it's not true of the literature at all.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that you addressed that. We're going to run out of time because we always do. And I could listen to you talk about this for much longer. And I want, before we lose the opportunity, to remind everyone that you're going to be doing a webinar for us. Is it next Tuesday, I think? Yeah. And so I'm very much looking forward to that. So go to our website, instituteofcoaching.org, and sign up for that so you can take a deeper dive with Lisa on the subject of addressing systemic issues. And, you know, before I let you go, you now have walked into what I consider to be a systemic ecosystem approach to this topic, right? So, you know, if you're sitting there as a leader and as an executive coach, and this is probably somewhat unique, but in healthcare and in some of these organizations where there's a lot of burnout, a lot of overwork, a lot of quiet quitting, you know, these things are now in the vernacular, right? And we know that this is happening. What kinds of things, what would you say is a great place to start to recognize that, you know, indoctrinating or having endemic and toxic imposter syndrome in your organization does not serve performance, flourishing, success, ROI? You know, how do you get people to move an awareness of that?
I mean, I think, you know, it's such a great question, and I want to pick it apart in a million pieces, and like just like answer different pieces of it. But I think one of the things that I think is so important is to recognize that, you know, oftentimes we thought this was a good thing to have. I hear people espouse that all the time, like it makes you work harder, it makes you more ambitious. But what it does do for certain is cause a lot of it causes a lot of issues related to mental health issues and productivity and, you know, ability to actually truly succeed. And that we have to rethink the way we have perceived not belonging or not as a good thing, as a motivator, and really allow people to really to stand in their true power and abilities and not be afraid of it. To actually believe that they can actually contribute in a much better way when they are holistically well, you know, and when they are feeling good about themselves and about the organization they're connected to, and that the organization represents something that they want to be connected to. And so, like, I really do think it takes a real rethinking of the way that we show up at work and what work represents and cultures of work. But and that's a huge undertaking, but I do think it's worth doing, because we say in the beginning of the book, one of my first organizational professors said, you know, you can't kiss a system. And I think, you know, the point of that being like, you know, that there's no one person you can identify created the system, but we all are part of systems that can, and we can make changes that actually do change the system. Like the individuals do make up the system, and there is power in the way that we show up in those worlds.
Yeah, beautifully said. I think at the end of the day, it behooves us all to step back and look at not just ourselves with self-awareness around these kinds of toxic narratives that may have come from our childhood or family system, but to look at the system we're embedded in, whether it's our work system or our friend system, wherever we are, and really, take accountability. It's not going to change unless we step together. And I love what you said about don't do it alone. Form a coalition, even if it's only three, right? Because you can really make a huge difference. So
Yeah.
I think it's so exciting that you took the time and the energy to do the research to take your work from an individual to a more systemic approach and mindset, because it's so crucial at this time. And so I'm so happy that you're here with us again. And
Thank you for having me.
looks like everybody is going to join us next week. I also want to remind everyone that we are also having our conference next week. We didn't get Lisa back this year because she spoke at our conference last year and Harvard wouldn't let us have her twice in a row. But we get to have a webinar with her the day before or 2 days before. So join us next week for the webinar with Dr. Lisa Orbe-Austin, and the conference on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, 3 half days, in which some of these themes will definitely be addressed. So we look forward to seeing you there. And congratulations again on the book, Lisa.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for this discussion. It's been super fun to
It's
see
always
you
fun
again.
for me to do stuff with you. So I always look forward to it. And we will see everyone next week. So all the best, everyone. Take care.